Okay, so this is really the last lecture of this course for fall 2020. And it's about chapter 25, the postmodern and contemporary art. So, what the purpose of this lecture is to kind of explain what that word postmodernism means, because it's kind of a confusing word. I didn't really understand it for a long time, but I think I do now. I mean, you can argue with that term and say that it's, um, I don't know, inappropriate or something, or doesn't describe late 20th century and early 21st century art very well. But uh, I'll just tell you what people mean when they say that word, when they use that word to describe the conditions that we lived in the late 20th century and early 21st century are called postmodern conditions for whatever reason. So I would say that the postmodern period as a social kind of period, you could say it started as early as the 1970s, and it really kind of started with that term started being used about architecture in the 70s. At least that's the first use of it that I know of. And, you know, it doesn't mean like post-modern. I mean, we're always living in a modern era, right? Whatever era we're in is the modern or contemporary era. But what modern refers to in the word postmodern is modernity and modernism. Modernity meaning a social condition that evolved beginning in the 19th century, really, with the acceleration of technological change and science and so on. And modernism in the arts, which really started in the mid 19th century, but really took off in the 20th century. And some people would say that the modernist style in art is over, but I don't think that's necessarily true either. It's just one style among many that you could use as a visual artist. Okay, so I think this will all become more clear when I show you some slides. So let me find my PowerPoint. Okay. Okay. All right. So yeah, we're going to be talking about what is postmodernism, and its general kind of themes, and the different media that evolved in the postmodern period in visual art. So to understand what postmodernism means in the visual arts, you kind of have to understand what modernism means. And to understand what modernism means, we have to go all the way back to the pre-modern art, you could say, pre-modernist art, which would be the art that evolved in the Renaissance, which we studied back some time ago in this class. So during the Renaissance, the 1400s and 1500s in Italy and also in Northern Europe, artists discovered or learned how to create convincing three-dimensional spaces on a flat surface and populate those spaces with people that looked anatomically real, like they learned how to draw people in a more representational way that respected the actual proportions of the human body and so on. And in that sense, it was kind of a revival of classicism, the same knowledge that the Greeks and Romans had had in ancient times, but that had gotten lost during the so-called Dark Ages of Europe, but that were revived in during the Renaissance. And so that knowledge and that style of visual art of creating a kind of window onto an imagined space that looked reasonably real, like here, this one point linear perspective is being used. The vanishing point is right here. The orthogonals on the floor and on the ceiling all converge to that vanishing point. The figures in front are larger than the figures in the back because these are further back in the picture. So all of that was what you learned when you became an artist in beginning in the Renaissance and continuing really for 400 years, which is kind of incredible. This style of uh, which became eventually called, the academic style because you learned it in an academic setting, the École de Beaux-Arts in France. It's amazing, really, that it prevailed without too much change for 400 years. I mean, small stylistic differences that we didn't really go over about the Baroque period and mannerism and all that, but they're all kind of variations on this same theme. And by the 19th century, it had gotten pretty old and kind of boring, although artists like Bouguereau were still extremely successful, and they were the ones who were exhibited at the salons rather than avant-garde artists. But avant-garde artists like Manet were really questioning that academic art tradition and messing with it. I mean, not a lot at first. I mean, all Manet did in Olympia really was refuse to go along with the idea that important painting had to have a mythological subject from the past or history painting from the past. He's just taking an ordinary, a sort of high-end prostitute and putting her in her boudoir in Paris and painting her kind of flat, not really modeling her body in the conventional academic way that would have been much sexier, but just kind of flattening it out and making her not ideally beautiful like a Venus. This is supposed to be Venus, a goddess, but just making her kind of ordinary. I mean, she's pretty, but she's not amazing. She's not idealized, in any way. So this is sort of the beginning of modernism, the recognition that the canvas is flat and that what you're looking at is paint on canvas. It's not really a window into into a real world, it's fake. And Manet is kind of making you confront that. And Monet, remember, they're two different guys. Monet, his contemporary, in the early 20th century, really took that further and just, instead of painting an academic landscape, paints the flat surface of the water in his pond at his garden in Giverny. So just like the surface of a pond is flat, the canvas is flat, but you can see not only water lilies floating on the surface of the water and fish swimming underneath the water, but you can see the reflection of the clouds in the sky on the water. So he makes you know that it's flat like a pond, but it has traces of the landscape around it. So this is a new kind of landscape painting, really, as was Matisse practicing. So Matisse, instead of drawing realistic figures in a naturalistic landscape, he uses a lot of the conventions of traditional academic landscape painting, the trees on both sides that sort of part almost like a curtain in a theater, and the sort of idealized mythological past of a lot of history paintings. But he messes with the size of the figure so that you're never really clear where you are in the painting. That the figures don't get smaller in an orderly way as you go back in the painting, because, for example, these women are almost as big as these women. Is this a child? I mean, why is this woman so much smaller than this woman? Then you have this little figure here. This person seems smaller than these people, but these people seem further back in the frame. And the whole thing is abstracted and it's decorative. It's not naturalistic. The line that designates this tree trunk is the same color and shape as this line around a figure here. So Matisse is pretty much moving strongly towards abstraction, and also using expressionist color, that is color that's not part of the natural world. By the way, the first part of this lecture is kind of a review of the course since the midterm, as you probably have figured out by now, but it's also sort of laying the groundwork for postmodernism. So that Matisse is definitely modernism, right? In the visual art sense, in that it's moving away from representation and towards a kind of abstraction. But of course, Picasso and Braque took that much further when they invented Cubism, and they broke apart the masses. Okay, these are flattened, but they're still recognizable as masses, like human bodies and trees, masses of trees. In Cubism, the mass itself is broken up and fragmented, and you're even less sure of where you are in relation to the figure. Like, where is your viewpoint? You seem to see this man's nose from the side and his eyes from the front. His guitar seems to be receding in space, but are these strings or frets? I mean, the whole, in Cubism, you're seeing something from multiple points of view at once, which definitely makes it more abstract. But Pollock really took that about as far as it could go. And this is, by the time he was painting on the floor and dripping paint onto the floor in these what art critics have called skeins, that is just lines made out of dripping paint. By this time, it was a total break with Renaissance painting or academic painting or any sort of recognizable naturalism or representation of any sort. What does this represent? I mean, you could still say, Braque says this is a guy in a bar. He's the Portuguese. It's a Portuguese man playing a guitar. And Matisse still keeps his connection to reality, you could say, in the sense that these are people in a landscape with trees and maybe some water in the background. I mean, this could be anything you wanted it to be. It's called autumn rhythm. Maybe that refers to the fact that Pollock made it in the autumn with a certain amount of rhythm to his performance. It's probably not about trees changing color. It has no connection. It doesn't start with the natural world and then abstract from there. It doesn't even start with the natural world. So in that sense, it's a bigger break with painting tradition, and in that sense, it's more abstract. Okay, so with sculpture, as we talked about in the lecture about minimalism and so on, maybe the last lecture, modernism in sculpture made the claim that sculpture was autonomous in the sense that Brancusi's bird in space means the same thing, whether it's in your house, on your coffee table, or in a museum. So its meaning doesn't depend on where it is, and it doesn't commemorate a battle or a famous person as sculpture did for a long time. It's just about mass and space and light, maybe, and shapes. So it's about the elements of art and not much else, even though he calls it bird in space. Okay, maybe it is a wing or a bird flying or whatever, but it doesn't seem to reference. You wouldn't necessarily know that if you didn't know the title. So postmodernism basically argues with that too, and says, okay, modernism, you're kind of over. There's no such thing as an autonomous work of art. Wait a minute. Like this. All of art is embedded in its place and in its time. And art and life are not separate. That is, you can't make an object like bird in space and put it on a coffee table and say, this has nothing to do with anything that's going on around it. That's postmodernism kind of says that's sort of crazy, that art is always kind of its time and embedded in a certain time and place. Postmodernism also, so I'm just going to go through this list kind of and explain it, and we'll see some examples of these things in the next few slides. Postmodernism also asserts that appropriation is good. That means appropriation means taking something from the hardware store, paying for it, and then making it into art, or taking something even from another artist's work, like rephotographing a photograph. That's one form of appropriation. And we'll see some other forms. It also says that hybrid media are good. That is, pure sculpture that has no paint on it. Sculpture doesn't have to be that way. In the modernist era, photography was photography over here, painting was painting over here. You would never paint on a photograph. You would never glue a photograph onto a painting. And so the media were kept pure. That was one of the ideas. But postmodernism started to argue with that. And also that the process of making something is as important as the product. Well, Pollock had already sort of gone there, right? His paintings are sort of record of a performance in a way. And then the whole idea of storytelling and figures come back, figuration. So history painting by the late 20th century, by the time I was in college in the 70s, nobody would go to art school to learn to do history painting. Like, even though a lot of important history was unfolding in the late 60s and early 70s, nobody would have thought to make a history painting about JFK's assassination or something. They made other kinds of art about that, but not a big, huge painting. Maybe because there were already photographs and movies of that event. But in the postmodern period, that is the late 20th century and early 21st century, people got interested again in the sort of Renaissance style of creating a kind of a theatrical painting on a two-dimensional surface that told a story. We'll see some examples of that in a minute. Now, you as a student probably take it for granted that artists are not necessarily white, male, straight, and Christian, or American, or European, that there's artists working all over the world in Asia and Africa and Latin America. But in the 20th century, the art scene was really the official art scene was kind of confined to New York City, Paris, maybe, and London, although not much was going on in Europe in the immediate post-war period. But now the art scene is global and post-colonial in the sense that artists who live in former colonies of the European powers are claiming to be, as important and as interesting as American and European artists. And sort of related to that, the human body and race, so-called race, which we know is not really a scientific category, but nevertheless kind of functions in our world as a category. Gender and sexual identity are all subjects of visual art, which they really hadn't been before. It was just assumed that the artist was a straight white guy. And so he wouldn't necessarily be making art about his own identity, like as a straight white man. I mean, although you could say that Pollock, in a way, was putting his body kind of in his paintings, but it wasn't about the fact that he's a straight white guy. Whereas a lot of art in the late 20th and early 21st century is about the identity of the artist. And then another postmodern idea is that art doesn't have to be a thing, really, that could be bought. It can be an event or a performance or even just an idea. And we'll see some examples of that. and that art can and should critique its own limitations. That is, it doesn't have to be, you could make something that's got to be outside of a gallery, like land art. It can't ever be inside a gallery. It's too big, spiral jetty. So that kind of critiques the whole idea that galleries and museums are where art happens. And because of that, art might appear outside of a gallery or a museum. All right. So Duchamp got this going, y'all. He may seem like a weird guy from the 20s, but you know, he got the ball rolling in terms of thinking about asking questions about what is art. So, you know, Duchamp is really asking here when he exhibited a snow shovel and called it In Advance of a Broken Arm. He's really asking, what is an art object? Does it have to be unique? The shovel isn't. Does it have to be handmade? The shovel isn't. Does it have to be in a separate realm from real life where tools and implements of mass destruction live? And he says, no, it can be mass produced. It can just be not handmade at all. If I say it's art and exhibit it as art, it's art. So Duchamp is really the forerunner of postmodernism, you could say. Can art be, okay, Warhol asked a serious question about visual art. Could it be about pop culture and mass consumer society? And of course, Warhol says, yes, it can. You know, there's no, formerly pop culture and mass society and consumer goods were thought of as not elevated enough for subjects for visual art. So, you know, your own angst, as in Pollock's paintings, were a fit subject for serious art, but not what you buy at the grocery store, like soup cans. But Warhol really questioned that. He says, yeah, the soup cans and Maryland and all the other stuff we consume is part of our world. And as such, those are valid subjects for visual art. And of course, Jasper Johns is saying, I'm just going to take this, I'm going to appropriate the American flag, and I'm just going to kind of make a copy of it, but it's going to be a painting in encaustic. So that sort of raises the question, what is representation? If you want to make a painting and represent a flag, do you have to make it a flag? Well, there's a photograph behind me of a flag in my neighbor's yard. Oops, you can't really see it. Johns is sort of asking, what is representation? When we represent something, does it have to be Renaissance representation where there's a flag flying on a flagpole? Or can we just take the symbol of a flag and represent that? And then his friend Rauschenberg asked the question, can art be just made out of junk, just out of stuff that you found? And really, Picasso and Braque had already started that process in synthetic cubism by, you know, just gluing newspaper onto a canvas, or in Picasso's case, making sculptures out of things that he found on the street, like bicycle parts and cans and colanders. He made a lot of amazing sculpture in the 30s out of just junk. And Rauschenberg is really taking that to the next level. Making assemblage, that is a sculpture assembled out of things that he found, and painting on them, which Picasso really didn't do. He would assemble things, but he didn't so much paint on the sculptures, on these assemblages. And then Donald Judd is asking the question, to what degree does the meaning of a work of art depend on the viewer's point of view or their sort of experience of the work of art? Because when you see the concrete boxes, their meaning depends entirely on where they are, to some extent what the weather is that day, your own body in relationship to the work. For example, it feels different when you get inside one of these boxes than it does when you're standing outside of the box. So you experience it differently. You experience it sort of with your body. So it interacts with you. It's not just there, out there somewhere in a museum. It's in a three-dimensional space that you are also in. And so there's a kind of relationship between you and the minimalist specific object. And Smithson asks, to be art, does something have to be in a museum or gallery? And he says, no, this can never be in a museum or gallery. It's just out in the Great Salt Lake, and it's always going to be there. In fact, it would be hard for anybody to even own this work of art. You could own a photograph of it, Gorgoni's photograph that he made flying over it. And actually, the Dio Foundation kind of owns it now, but they can't move it around. Like they can't, it's not a commodity in the sense that a painting or a portable sculpture might be. So even more, less commodity of a commodity is a performance. So when we learned about Dada, I talked about the Cabaret Voltaire, where Hugo Ball and some other Dada artists would just do a performance, a sort of nonsensical performance a lot of the time, that they improvised to some degree on the spot. Not like a play where there was a script or anything, but more like just a happening, an event. And called it art. But no one could own it, really. There were very few records even made of it. There's this photograph of one of the performances at the Cabaret Voltaire. So the whole idea that a performance or an event could be a work of art began with Dada, as so much of postmodernist art did. And artists in the 70s really took that and ran with it. Now, Pollock in the 50s had already gone there, kind of, by making his painting a type of performance. And the critic Harold Rosenberg acknowledged that. He said, the canvas began to appear as an arena in which to act. What was to go on the canvas was not a picture, but an event. Now, this sort of laid the groundwork, along with Dada, for performance art and conceptual art. So as early as 1960, there were artists like Yoko Ono. Yes, that Yoko, the one that later married John Lennon. But before she married John Lennon, she was a conceptual artist working in New York. So what did she do as a conceptual artist? And I think also in London, maybe. Well, she just came up with ideas for works of art that you maybe would never actually be performed. And in that sense, they existed only as an idea in some cases. So, for example, pea peas. Carry a bag of peas. Leave a pea wherever you go. So, I'm assuming she means dried peas, not frozen peas. And I've really been tempted to do the pea piece. I've got some so-called Crowder peas that I grew. There's one called Big Red Ripper that I like a lot. I could just walk around with that, and when I go to Kroger or whatever, just kind of leave a pea. But I haven't done it yet. I might do it when our campus opens up again, and maybe leave some peas around the campus. Maybe that would be too mean to the people who have to clean it up. But you get the idea. I mean, she has a whole book of these things, including this, cloud peas. Imagine the clouds dripping. Dig a hole in your garden to put them in. So, again, this is just conceptual art. You could probably come up with something like this yourself and call it conceptual art. It doesn't exist. It's completely dematerialized. It can't be bought and sold. And anybody can do it, right? You don't have to be special or have any sort of special training. And that, again, talks about the lack of separation between art and life. that they're not autonomous. Art is not an autonomous zone that never intersects with the practical concerns of real life. Although this is not all that practical. But still, anybody can do it. You don't have to be a trained artist. All right, so Yoko also experimented with performance art. Now, conceptual art and performance art overlap a little bit, you could say. So this is her piece called Cut Piece, where she sat in a very nice wool suit on the floor of a gallery and with a pair of scissors, and people could come up and cut bits of the suit off of her body until she was just left there in a shredded suit with a bra on. Somebody cut the straps to her bra. And there's a link to a video in your content of this very interesting early performance piece. So Yoko was kind of a pioneer in performance art. And then she married John Lennon. And they knew that their wedding was going to be like this media circus, you know. So they decided to use it as an opportunity to do a performance art piece, which they called Bed In for Peace. And they did it in a hotel in Amsterdam in Europe. And I'm not sure exactly how long the Bed In for Peace went on, but this was at the height of the Vietnam era, where there were thousands of casualties every week, American and Vietnamese. It was a really terrible period in a lot of ways. And the anti-war movement was in full swing by 1969, the movement against the draft and against the war in general. And Lenin and Ono were part of the anti-war movement. So they invited members of the media, you know, reporters and journalists, to come to their hotel room, which would be open from 9 in the morning to 9 at night. And they would just be there talking about peace, not having sex, not naked or anything, just in their pretty pajamas, sitting in bed. Now, why does it say hair piece and bed piece behind them? I don't know. That's just part of some things in performance art are not like Dada. It's not always rational or logical. It's just about one thing I love about this picture is this really old-timey telephone down here. And also this tape recorder. Around the same time I had a tape recorder like that, which, it was one of my prized possessions. Okay. All right. So even before Yoko and John did the Bed In for Peace, using your body and your sexuality as a sort of topic for performance art was being explored, especially by women artists and feminist artists. And Carolee Schneemann is really one of the founding mothers, you could say, of feminist performance art, maybe the founding mother, along with Yoko, maybe. So, you know, this is a confusing photograph, and I'm not sure exactly what's going on in it. The reason I have it here in this slide is that the slide that I used to have upset people so much that I had to take it out. It was about a work of art that she did, called a performance piece called Interior Scroll. So Interior Scroll is so avant-garde that I can't even show it in a PowerPoint without offending people. But there's a lot of information about it in your content. So you can go to the content for chapter 25 and you on your own can research and find out what Interior Scroll was all about if you want to know. I hope that's enough of a sort of a teaser. I hate to use that word in this case. But again, some students got very upset when I projected an image from Interior Scroll several years ago. So I just don't do it anymore. I mean, why go there? You can look it up yourself. But the gist of it, of Carolee Schneemann's work, I think, is using your own body as a woman artist to challenge traditional representations of women in visual art and in the media. In other words, think back to the sort of Venus, birth of Venus paintings. Well, how real is that really? If you're a woman, how much does that really correspond to your reality? You know, you don't look like that. You know, you've got, pubic hair, you've got hair under your arms, you've got hair in all these places that you're not supposed to have hair, and you're constantly shaving it off or waxing it off or whatever. So those Venuses were not real, and no one is born out at sea on a shell or anything like that. So it's pretty hard to relate to those paintings as a woman, I think. And also, it's kind of offensive to see an image of somebody who's supposed to look like you just being the passive object of the male gaze. So that's a pretty important concept in postmodern feminist art, the male gaze. So most visual art assumes a male gaze, right? Even Manet, who was sort of questioning representations of women, assumed that the person looking at Olympia would be a man. If you're a woman looking at it, well, you're just kind of with the guy, I guess. You just happen to be there, but it's not really for you, right? And so, but in the beginning in the 60s and still continuing into the present, women artists are representing themselves and their own bodies in a way that is more in sync with their experience of themselves. And that includes the experience of menstruation, for example, which was never a topic of visual art until Carolee Schneemann, really, and birth, which is also sort of taboo. Like, you're not supposed to make a work of art about maybe the most important moment of your life when you push a baby out. Have you ever seen a painting of that? I don't think so. So Schneemann and other women were sort of thinking about that. Like, why aren't these important experiences in women's lives? Why aren't they represented in visual art? Well, they're not. So let's just go do it. So, but it's still so upsetting that, people walk out of the classroom when you show interior scrolls. So you go look at it for yourself. Now, oddly though, when men make art about their body or their sexuality, people don't walk out of the room. No one has ever walked out of the room when I've showed this slide about Vito Acconci's piece, Seedbed. All right, so what Vito did, and I met Vito, he was a wonderful person. I didn't meet him when he in 1972, although I was around. I was not too far from New York City at this time. I was in New Jersey, but I didn't know Vito then. I didn't meet him until 2004, and he was an old guy. He died not that long ago. Anyway, so Vito does this performance piece where he gets a gallery space. He builds a ramp in the gallery space, and he gets underneath the ramp and he masturbates under there while speaking into a microphone. And the words that he's speaking into the microphone come out of this little speaker. So he can hear you walking around above him. He doesn't know if you're a man or a woman when you come in the gallery. And he says, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. I've been thinking about you for days." Actually, I don't know what he says. But there's a video in the content where he talks about how he came up with this idea and what he thought it was about. So here's some of the notes I made about it. And in this sense, it exemplifies performance art. It's performance as a task, and not necessarily a glamorous or heroic task, but a kind of grueling task. Because he was in this space for like 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for weeks. I think 3 or 4 weeks. So it was not fun. It was tiring. And he was underneath in this sort of cramped space. And, a lot of performance art is like that. It sort of tests the limits of the human body, what it can survive or stand, And it can be a bit masochistic. Now, one thing I like about Carolee Schneemann is her work is never masochistic. It's always a celebration of the body. With a lot of performance art, though, it is a bit masochistic, including a lot of women's performance art. That's why I don't really like cut piece that much, because for the same reason. So, an example of that is Marina Abramovic, who's still doing performance art. It kind of isn't as big a deal as it was in the 70s, you could say, but she's kept up with it. Now, in the 70s, she and her partner, Ule, did all kinds of performance art pieces, a lot of them. And this was just one of them. They braided their hair together, or sort of put their ponytails into one ponytail and sat like that for a certain number of hours. I'm not sure exactly how long. It's pretty uncomfortable. A lot of their work is a test of the limitations of the body. I mean, Marina did some incredible things when she was young in the 70s that really, some of them were pretty crazy and pretty dangerous. And I think that's why performance art kind of died out in a way, was it was just people were taking it too far and doing things, really dangerous things that almost killed them. So, but recently in 2010, Abramovic did something that again was grueling and a test of the body's endurance, but not dangerous. It couldn't kill her. So there was a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, which means a big show that goes back over decades of a person's work, about performance art. And it had a lot of films and documents and re-performances of famous performance art works of the 70s and 80s. And she invented a new performance piece for this show called The Artist is Present. And what she did was she did this in the lobby of the Museum of Modern Art. She set up a table with two chairs, and this is her on the left. And she sat there for all day, for all the days that the museum was open, so 6 days a week, I think, from morning to night with no breaks, no bathroom breaks, no water breaks, no lunch breaks. And people could come and sit down across from her for as long as they wanted to. So the directions on the wall said, sit silently with the artist for a duration of your own choosing. And some people sat there for a few minutes. Some people sat there for over an hour. And so a line would form over against the wall, as you can see, where people waited for their turn to sit across from her. And you don't say anything. You just sit with her, looking at her. And when I taught this about this piece 2 or 3 years ago in Livingston, that class decided to try this. And so each person tried to sit across from somebody else and look at them for just 5 minutes. And most people couldn't do it. I did it with one student, and we managed to do it the whole time, the whole 5 minutes. But it was hard and it was very weird. When, I mean, I already knew that student, but I didn't know him well. So he's kind of a stranger. And this is even more like that. People are just coming in off the street and sitting across from her, people she's never seen before. So, and this was very tiring, she said. Now, you may wonder, how did she get through this without going to the bathroom? Well, there's a little secret to that. I don't know if I should tell you this because it's a little bit gross, but it's part of the whole performance art thing. There's a little potty underneath the chair, so that if she absolutely had to pee, she could pee through a little hole in her chair and it would go into this little potty. Now, on this side, there was no such a thing. So this guy can't pee into a little potty, but she had a little potty. It took a lot of research for me to find out that little fact. But it may be something you were wondering too. Okay. Now, I said that postmodern art, a lot of it is about identity. And I think the person whose work exemplifies this the best, there's a lot of work about identity, meaning your just the body you happen to be born into, like whether you're male or female, what race you are, what nation you're from, what your sexual orientation is. That's what we call identity in contemporary art. Now, obviously, there's more to your identity than just how you happen to be born. Arguably, the more important parts of your identity have nothing to do with your so-called race or your gender or your sexual orientation. But that's what identity means in contemporary art. So Kara Walker is a youngish Black woman artist who makes art about race and history in America, you could say. So, and at some point in her career, and she talks about this in a video in the content that you should watch because it's really interesting. She came up with this idea of the silhouette, the cut silhouette, using black paper. So and these are big. These may look small in the slide, but they're almost life size. So when you go into a Kara Walker show, you're in a room, you're standing in a kind of, well, you're in a room like this with almost life-size cutouts, black cutouts against a white background. And some of the figures seem to be white and some seem to be black. Sometimes it's really hard to tell, but she kind of uses stereotypes about race to indicate what race the people are. And according to Hal Foster, whose book has some information about this, he calls this the stereotypical grotesque. That is, taking stereotypes about race and sort of pushing them about your own race and pushing them to an absurd extreme. So Walker herself says, the illusion is that most of my work is simply about past events, a point in history and nothing else, like the antebellum period when slavery was a thing, or the Civil War or something like that. But she actually says it's about a lot more than that. It's about fantasies. It's about kind of fascinations that people have with people's sexuality or their race or history, and the kind of perverse fascination, maybe polymorphous perversity would be the best word to use about that. So you can see there's a lot of slightly perverse things going on, or more than slightly perverse. There's somebody farting here. There's a kid apparently following this lady and looking up her skirt. It's not clear what he's doing. It's a lot of times the lack of clarity is the point. It's not clear what's going on. Like, is this guy riding this girl? Is this a rabbit with a pop gun? Is it Brer Rabbit? So what's going on? In this piece, Darkytown Rebellion, she found an old historical painting called Darkytown that was unclear what it was about. She found it in a thrift store or something. And she took that and ran with it, kind of, and made it into this whole panorama about a slave revolt that involved, killing the masters with sort of household implements like spoons. So again, it's the stereotypical grotesque. The bodies are exaggerated in ways that are grotesque. Like, why does this guy seems to have a bone in his butt and he's missing a leg? And is that his penis? Is this the leg that fell off? Why does she seem to have is this a grass skirt? We don't know. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, but I hope that you, again, in college, the lectures and the readings are just a start, really. And you're expected to go out and learn as much as you can about this stuff. And I've made it pretty easy for you. The content module for chapter 25 has a lot of additional videos and information about Kara Walker, uh, Vito Acconci, Carol Schneeman, and other postmodern and contemporary artists that you should look into, because you'll need that information when you start working on the exam. So the exam is due on December 7th, which I think is a Tuesday, like a week from this Tuesday. Yeah, that's right. No, it's due on December 7th is a Monday. So it's due a week from today, which is November 30th. And as a result, there's no question due this week and no other lecture. So you have a whole week to work on the midterm. I mean, on the final exam. So do as good a job as you can. And above all, don't plagiarize. Remember, if you copy a sentence into your own work, into your own writing, and just change 2 or 3 words a little bit, it's still plagiarism. So, paraphrase or quote, but don't copy. So that's all I have, and I'm looking forward to reading your essays on the final exam.